The author of Hebrews, in chapter 10 verses 5 to 10, quotes an Old Testament passage from Psalm 40. In this quote, he presents Jesus as the one who fulfills God's ultimate plan of salvation. The passage speaks of sacrifices and offerings not being desired by God, but instead, a body being prepared for Jesus. This body would serve as the perfect sacrifice, unlike the repeated animal offerings under the law. However, if we look at the original Psalm 40 in the Old Testament, the wording is different. It doesn't mention a body being prepared but rather says, "You have given me an open ear." So, the question arises, did the New Testament distort the Old Testament here? How can we trust the New Testament's inspiration if it seems to change the wording of the Old Testament? To address this concern, we need to understand that the New Testament authors, including the writer of Hebrews, often use different textual traditions of the Old Testament. While today we often rely on the Hebrew Masoretic text, the early church also used the Septuagint, a Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures, which sometimes contains different wording. For example, in the Septuagint, Psalm 40 does mention a body being prepared, rather than open ears. This difference points to an older form of the text that the Septuagint preserved. The author of Hebrews was quoting from this version, which included a body instead of ears. So, it wasn't a distortion, but a use of a different manuscript tradition that was available at the time. The theological message remains the same in both versions. Psalm 40, whether we focus on the ears being opened or the body being prepared, is ultimately about obedience to God's will. It highlights that God desires more than just outward sacrifices. He desires total surrender and obedience. As it says in Psalm 40 verse 8, "I delight to do your will, O my God. Your law is within my heart." This brings us to Jesus. The writer of Hebrews shows that Jesus was the perfect embodiment of this obedience. He didn't come to perform ritual sacrifices, but to do the will of God perfectly. As Mark 10 verse 45 tells us, "For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." The open ears in Psalm 40 symbolize readiness to hear and obey God's will. Just like the body prepared for Jesus symbolizes his role as the perfect sacrifice for sin. Both images point to the same truth. God desires a heart of obedience, not just ritual acts. We see this idea of Jesus' obedience throughout the Gospels. In John 6 verse 38, Jesus says, "For I have come down from heaven, not to do my own will, but the will of him who sent me." This was the mission of Jesus, to fulfill God's will by offering his body as the final and perfect sacrifice. So, when we look at the different textual traditions between the Old and New Testaments, we see that they don't contradict each other but rather complement each other. They both point to the central truth that God's desire is for a willing, obedient heart. And Jesus fulfilled this desire completely by offering his body as the ultimate sacrifice, doing what no animal offering could ever accomplish. In the end, both Psalm 40 and Hebrews 10 call us to surrender fully to God's will, just as Jesus did. Whether it's our ears being open to hear his voice or our bodies being offered in service, the heart of the message is clear. God wants us to give ourselves wholly to him.